thanks Mike and Bastian for organizing this, and you now too. So what we'll be talking about is our work on the land-atmosphere coupling, primarily with the GISS ModelE, and our particular focus though is on human interventions in the terrestrial or the land-atmosphere coupling. So that's our main focus, and I'm working primarily with Ben Cook, and like all things at GISS, our work wouldn't be possible without Max's help on with the Model E, and also Igor's been quite helpful working through the land surface models. So before we start, just to so this is one of the acronyms that has been popping up in the CMIP 5 or the fifth assessment report runs, and at first time I saw it, I thought it was horrible. You never do this, but the more you work with it, then you start getting used to it, and that's a bad thing. So it stands for land use induced land cover change, and so this really refers to human modification of the Earth's terrestrial surface, primarily through agriculture and urbanization.
Okay, wait.
Yes.
How do you pronounce this?
I have no idea, so
Okay.
I am cutting this out of the presentation.
Secondly, you say terrestrial surface. What about land use policies that remove terrestrial surface or add to the terrestrial surface? Do you include that in this?
That's beyond this.
That's my
Well, that's a change. Well, no, it's an
Or
increase.
saying-
It's not a change. It's an increase. Or if you look at the
Well,
like
it's
the Gulf,
changing it from an ocean
look at the
surface
Gulf
to
Coast
a-
off the where the Mississippi dumps in
Yeah.
the Delta. All those small islands have disappeared. So is that included in this?
That is not included
Okay.
in this.
I'm just asking.
Yes.
Modeling Dubai.
Can I just,
Yeah, Dubai.
so, actually, I won't say that either, but you originally had something called land use and land cover change, which, use is the use and land cover is just what's there, so land cover could change naturally.
Very naturally.
Is this the most recent, or is this just used for the anthropogenic changes now?
I think this is more focused on the human component. That's my guess, and I don't know the details of that.
Oh, you're right, that's a common rose, there's a roses call for LULC. That's
Not just them, but lots
yeah,
of other
lots of
people.
And that's focused on human.
It's called land use
it's not-
and land cover change.
Land
It
use
was.
and land coverage.
or just and land cover. I think the change is not always this.
No, those two C's were there.
So most of these changes are focused on agricultural changes. So for this talk we'll just call it land change, and it refers to the human component. So what's our question? And what we're not so much interested in the impacts of land change on the global temperatures, because most studies have found that any land surface changes are negligible when you start averaging over the globe. But we're really interested in intense land change, and that means when you have large regions of the Earth's surface, particularly China, India, parts of the US, where there's been a significant modification of the vegetation cover. And here we're interested in the spatial component, the spatial organization to that. And so then we might ask, the real research question that we're interested in, so are the impacts in these regions with intense land change, is it important to account for these land changes when we're trying to understand the impacts of greenhouse gases on regional climate? So are these changes significant relative to these greenhouse gas related changes?
I don't understand the difference between land change
And what?
like land change and intense land change.
So intense land change, so we're really talking about, so if for New York City, for example, it's limited to a relatively small area, right? Unless you start including all the suburbs, but the intense land change, the land change in New York City is somewhat limited. But if you go to regions
Compared to what?
compared to China, so if we go to
Like,
regions
no,
in
I mean
China.
like in the last 10 years, the last 100 years. Or,
The time scale of that?
yeah.
Yeah, I guess here I'm referring to the spatial so the density of the land change. I guess if we want to talk about the time characteristics of that change, that's something else. So here really, maybe intensity, saying intense somewhat implies a time component, but here, not so much. We're really talking about the density of land cover change.
Sorry to do this to you, but I sort of have a question about this too.
Yeah.
So, when you put in farms, for example, in Europe, you're cutting down all the forests, that's a big change from what was there to what replaces it.
Right.
It's very different in the US and, for example, in grasslands, if they're replaced with farming, it doesn't look that different sometimes.
That's right.
But that's also basically a removal of a similar ecosystem and replacement with an anthropogenic one. So where does that fit in with intent for you?
Well, it's quite important, and actually I'll just, after this slide, I'll briefly talk about the intercomparison project that's just been, or one phase of the land use intercomparison project that's just been completed for the fifth assessment report. And that's one of the key issues. What are you replacing with agriculture, for example? So this is a change in pasture, your typical plot of the increase in pasture and crop extent globally. This is based on the Raman-Cuddy and Foley data. And essentially, red is increases in human areas, so increases in agriculture. And so if you're trying to model this change in land cover, it depends upon what your base or natural vegetation is. And just talking from a modeling perspective, the different groups have different approaches. So at GISS, if we put in crops, if we replace the natural vegetation with crops, we remove proportionally from the same amount or the same proportion from each of the different vegetation that are within that grid cell. Now, other groups will, they'll have a strategy where they'll first replace grasslands with the crops, and they'll have some strategy like that. So whichever strategy you choose will have a very large impact on the climate impacts you have from these changes in crop extent. So that's one of the key things. So this is just a change from 1992, between 1992 and 1870. And you see the major regions, in the central US, you're replacing mostly grassland. We have increases in, I guess, forest cover in the northeastern US, decreases in crop cover throughout Eurasia and India and China as well, and of course South America. So we want to try and understand how these changes interact with the climate system. So there was a nice review paper by Roger Pilkey Sr. And he, so what are the main things we expect? The zero order changes due to land cover change. So first thing is, if we're talking about deforestation, you might expect an increase in surface albedo, and that might result in cooling. So this is just what you might think about first. But at the same time, deforestation decreases your evapotranspiration efficiency. And it also affects your surface aerodynamic roughness, which could cause warming. So you have these competing changes due to land cover change. And just, the first order changes that you would consider. So the intercomparison paper, it's in press in the Journal of Climate, and it just came out, and they're looking at the CMIP-5 climate models, and they took 7 land atmosphere models, and the idea was to look at, so this is their goal. It's a common experimental design to explore the impacts of land change that are robust and consistent across models. Because the challenge has been that you have different climate models will have different responses to these land cover changes.
Do you have any sense of how different the vegetation distributions are for these?
So it was quite significant. So, just reading through their paper, they, when they go and put in these changes in crop pasture extent, the fraction, the percent change of natural vegetation was quite, it ranged from, a change of 30% to a change in, I would say maybe like 50% in a grid cell. So we're talking about differences, relative to your natural vegetation of say 20% among these 7 models, across these 7 models. So it's substantial, and it all comes down to how each of these models treat the land surface and partition the land surface between bare soil, vegetation, how these models treat your soil column. So all of these things.
But it's also about pasture is probably the biggest difference that explains that. Because
Meaning what?
pasture is not it's a very vague kind of a description
Right, so
about
you're
whether they're
saying-
planted or not. If you remove I'm just curious, if you remove the pasture,
Mhm.
they all use the same land use changes, right?
They use the same
Distribution.
crop changes, yeah.
Yeah, so pasture is probably a big piece
Right,
there.
so,
because
and
it's
the other
part
part of this is, the plant functional types, which you're referring to, do they have pasture, how many plant types do they have in
Or
their model?
defined
Defined
or described
vegetation.
vegetation, yeah.
So yeah, that, for sure, that's the other.
But
piece
pastures
of the
are just
puzzle.
grassland, yes?
What's that?
Pastures are just grassland, or?
Generally, like C3 grass or they could be C4
Some
grass.
is really planted, like in the
Yeah.
Netherlands, it's just like it's a crop.
Mhm.
But most pastures in probably the world are not planted at all. They're, Australia, and they're arid and,
So basically it would be the same, from the model point of view, it would be the same as just grassland.
no,
No?
not in arid environments, no. They're not grasses. They're not grasses in a lot of the Sahel, they're not grasses in Australia, they're not grasses probably in, a good chunk.
So just to, the findings from this intercomparison project, they found that the variability from land change was great among the 7 models was greater than the variability from the greenhouse gas forcings, from the greenhouse gas increases. So, the issue is here now. A lot of these climate models are including more land surface processes, more, so they have dynamic vegetation. There's a greater variability in how the land surface is treated, as I said. Whether you break your grid cell into, you could have tiles of different vegetation types, but then again, how you treat your soil column, that becomes important. So all of these different ways of representing the land surface end up leading to significant variability from land change. And then
Variability in what?
variability, so this is the variability in the climate predictions, so in temperature and precipitation, so the variability
Across the models?
across the models, yeah, across the 7 models.
Globally or regionally?
So this is more, it's probably over the land surface, so regionally. I don't recall exact details, but yeah, so it wasn't, it's not the global average, of course, it's for the different regions. So if you focus in, the 2 regions they looked at are this region here in North America and this region in Eurasia. So the variability in temperature, precipitation was greater considering these land changes for those regions.
And those greenhouse gas increases, are they due to land use change, you're saying?
No. So it's just your standard
Fossil fuel emissions?
Fossil fuel emissions.
Those include land use, if they're using the,
For sure. It is, I guess it's just not interactive or anything like that.
Does it or not? Does it include carbon changes does the greenhouse gas effect include carbon changes from land use change? You asked that, but.
well, I don't know,
It does. How is it included?
Which scenarios are these, the 5, are they only?
The RCP pathways.
Oh, so
but
they may not explicitly.
well, it's not interactive.
But you don't know
I
what
mean,
they are because no one tells you. Sorry.
So they
The
ran
mystery,
these
yeah.
without greenhouse forcing, just with the land use changes, and that's how they're getting this variability? How do they separate variability changes from land use from the greenhouse gas? They must have run.
Yeah, they ran control simulations and then changes with simulations with the changes.
You're probably using observed climate if it's
Observed
greenhouse
SSTs.
gases, yeah.
Yeah, it's observed
Yeah.
greenhouse
So
gas.
basically every model, I guess, uses the same greenhouse gas.
Right.
We don't know
So
what
just
the
briefly,
means, they're not explaining, you have no idea.
Right.
Just briefly though, they had some robust common features across models, meaning the amount of available energy for turbulent fluxes was consistent across models. And the changes in response to land change depended almost linearly on the amount of trees that you removed. So that was some robust finding that they had. But what's most important here is that there was no consistency on the partitioning of available energy between the latent heat and the sensible heat. And so that's really key if we're trying to get at temperature and precipitation changes due to the land cover change. And there wasn't any consistency across the models on these variables. Why is that? Well, as I've been alluding to, how you represent the land surface affects the local coupling. So, some models will have, 2 layers, 3 layers of the soil and keep track of water and energy for those few layers, whereas other models will have between 6 to 12 layers. So that's all important. How you represent evapotranspiration is important. The functional relationship that you use, how the roots take water from the different layers. This all becomes important on this coupling strength. And so this varies pretty dramatically across the models, and so that's one source of these model differences. You also have the precipitation parameterizations, which vary across models. And then you have these non-local issues where you have advection and the general circulation of the atmosphere. And precipitation is notoriously difficult to predict. So differences in precipitation among models is going to be really important when you're trying to get at these land-atmosphere coupling issues. So I'll present the results that we have based on irrigation, just very briefly, stuff on deforestation that Ben led, and then more recently the work that's underway on urbanization, and then just end with overall sense of where we're going with this research. So the irrigation and climate. So Ben and I published this paper looking at the effects of irrigation on climate during the 20th century. The idea was to get a sense of how the impacts of irrigation varied as irrigation has increased quite dramatically since 1960. So we want to get a sense, can we detect the climate impacts within the model? Obviously irrigation is going to affect your energy and water budgets, potentially leads to lower temperature, higher humidity, and then it impacts convection. So, then just get a sense, it's quite a complex interactions when we're thinking about this within a coupled system. So we want to get a sense of what these impacts are. So this is the GISS ModelE land surface model. It's a little too small to read, but basically we have your vegetated fraction of your grid cell and your bare soil. And so then we keep track of the flow of water within the vegetated soil column and the bare soil column. So we were a bit constrained here. We didn't have a separate soil column for the irrigated agriculture. We made a simplification here where we ended up applying the irrigated water over the entire vegetated portion of your soil column. So that's, well, I'll discuss that when we get to our results in a bit, the implications of that. So for these results, we have 5 member ensemble simulations. We're using the F40, the 2x2.5 Model E with observed sea surface temperatures. And so we have irrigation added to the top of your soil column as a flux. Now I used irrigation data set that was from an offline water balance model where they estimated the volumes of water associated with irrigation using a global offline land surface model. So essentially you would estimate, so you have a map of the areas equipped for irrigation globally, and then you have a crop model. And so you would add water to the crops if the soil moisture was below a certain threshold. And so this gave us a global data set of irrigation volumes or fluxes globally at a month by month for the whole 20th century.
Michael, can you say more about what it means when land is equipped for irrigation?
So when you
The mask, I guess it is, or?
so it was an attempt by the FAO, I believe, the FAO to catalog regions that have irrigation equipment that can potentially have irrigation. So
What does that
whether
mean?
or not you irrigate.
What's irrigation equipment? I guess, what is that?
So sprinklers and, well, most irrigation globally is the flood irrigation, right? So you have to have your canal network. You have to have the infrastructure to be able to flood your fields.
Okay.
So that's what areas equipped for irrigation means. So yeah, I think globally this flood irrigation is by far the dominant form of irrigation. So, right. So this we brought in that data, or this other group brought in the data of the areas equipped for irrigation, and then you're not going to irrigate. Farmer's not going to irrigate if it's a wet year, right? So it'll depend on the rainfall in a given year whether or not they're irrigating. So that's why you use the soil moisture, the amount of water within the soil, to determine whether or not you're adding water for irrigation. Right? And so we add this irrigation as a flux. We treat it as some observed flux. We take the water within the climate model, the Model E. We will take the water from lakes or rivers within the grid sum. And if there's not enough water within those lakes or rivers, then we'll add water to the system, assuming it's some fossil water or water from a groundwater aquifer. And so that's essentially what happened in reality. People, when they pump water from deep aquifers, are adding water to the system because some of these deep groundwater aquifers are essentially hydraulically removed from the climate system over the time scales that we're interested in.
So rainfall did not provide irrigation water,
Well,
which is huge in Asia.
So rainfall.
Not from lakes and rivers, rainfall.
So in the offline model, they will drive it with the reanalysis data, so the CREW data, I think it was. So that says if it's raining or not in a given year. Then the model keeps track of how much water is in the soil. So the decision whether to irrigate or not, it depends upon how much water is in the soil. So then the model keeps track of how much water you have to add to the soil to keep it at a certain level.
I understand the model part, but large chunks of land are only irrigated by rainwater. If the rain happens, then let's say coming down terrace fields. But if the rain doesn't happen, there are no lakes or rivers to do that.
Right. So the rain-fed agriculture you're talking about, and so those are.
I'm talking about things like not rain. Major irrigation, canals, all that stuff. Let's say terrace fields, rice fields.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that, the only way it gets any irrigation is lots of rainfall, and then the stuff goes into canals and it's sort of led down the mountain, for example. But if there's rain, and there is, that's the water that's used. But if the rain is low, there is no alternative to take that water from lakes and rivers. So are you using rainwater? Are you using rainfall for irrigation exactly, or?
Well, in the model it can be treated as artificial lakes. Are you saying that you're collecting?
No, it can't.
You are collecting rainwater and store it until it is needed for irrigation?
No, it's literally, you can't store it. It's just it comes down.
Well, what comes to the soil, we don't call it irrigation. It's already basically just natural process. what he's talking about is.
But it's used for flooding fields, it's used for irrigation in fields. In, let's say terraced farming, you know, the raised field, right? So that is the irrigation. It's rain-fed, it's rain-fed flooding.
Call it
Is-
rain funneled, yeah.
Or whatever, so I'm just trying to,
But you guys
I'm not trying to give you a hard time, I'm trying to
For
understand.
the GISS
that.
model, we basically, so this irrigation data set we used is basically just prescribed based on that offline estimates from the Seabird group, or whoever they,
Yeah, Seabird and-
whoever did it. We just took a sort of, the first sort of way we did it was to just take this offline data set and prescribe it as additional water to the surface. To try to constrain some sort of water balance, we had the code withdraw as much water as possible from nearby lakes and rivers to satisfy that demand.
I see, and
If it
I-
couldn't satisfy that demand, then we drew from outside the system and caused it possible.
I understand what the model's doing, I'm just trying to understand this piece, which is a big chunk of irrigation in the world, that's all I'm trying to find out.
Sure, but this
And does the soil moisture, and soil moisture can be positive? Does the soil scheme provide for flooding on the surface? Or is it just
Well,
water
any-
table up to the surface?
and it's water table up to the surface, right?
Water table up to surface, and
Okay.
other water runs off
Okay.
to the rivers.
Yeah.
Okay,
So,
thanks.
yeah,
Sorry, I have a question about to stay on this slide. As the soil scientist
Yeah.
in this room, maybe the one, I'm just curious how you characterize a soil column, like in terms of texture that might limit your capacity and also determine how much water is in the column. And I'm just wondering what's the depth of this column? How far do you go? Do you only go to rooting depth for this modeling exercise,
so
or
this
beyond
is
the rooting depth?
So it's a 3.5 layer, 3.5 meter thick model with 6 layers. We get the soil textures from, so from the cube sphere we got it from this Reynolds global data set. For the 2 by 2.5 model, we had the older, this is a web, I forgot. It's one of the older from the UNESCO 1972 soil type data set. But essentially, at the end of the day, those textures are only used to inform the rate of infiltration and the porosity within the soil. So it's just those two parameters. So porosity, the hydraulic conductivity. I think those are the two main parameters that
Heat
were.
capacity.
And the heat capacity. So some few soil properties that are used. So nothing too complex. We don't look at soil or organic content or anything like that. So that's how our soil column is. Right. So the seasonal irrigation on the top, December, January, February. On the bottom, June, July, August. And this is for early 20th century. So this is 1905 to 1925, some average of that period. And so,
What's the unit of it?
so this is in
The yellow?
millimeters.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Millimeters. And so, it's on a log scale. So, the areas of yellow and green yellow are relatively low rates of irrigation. And so, but you see, it's the main areas. We have China, India, the Indus River basin. In June, July, August, you can see within the United States. We have in the western United States, in California, you'll see some irrigation, and throughout Europe. So those are our main irrigations. That's what we would expect. This is the total over these 3 months. If we move to end of the 20th century, we see irrigations much more spatially extensive and much more intense. So we have really the Indus River basin has some of the highest irrigation rates in the world, and again northeastern China, so they have some wheat grown in the northeastern part of the country, and then in the central southern parts, I guess you have more paddy rice cultivation.
But that has less irrigation, doesn't it?
What's that?
Southeastern China has less irrigation than
Well,
north.
this is Southeast Asia, right? So,
Well,
I mean, the irrigation rates might be a bit higher in the northeast.
It's dry, so.
Makes sense.
So yeah, and so we have then also in the Ogallala aquifer, and then you also see out in California, we have large irrigation rates there. So this is what's changed. We add this into the model, and we want to see the climate impact. So first order estimate. Just to look at it in a different way, the time series, we have the blue is June, July, August, red is December, January, February, and for the different latitude bands. Our units are, this is down kilometers cubed, kilometers. So you see, in 1950, we see dramatic increases, particularly, here in 0 to 30 north. Irrigation rates are substantially higher. Same thing, 30 to 60 north. The scale here is much smaller, so in the southern hemisphere, as expected, it's much smaller. So really what we're interested in is from between 0 and 60 north. This is where most of the land area is and most of the irrigation is. So we will first look at seasonal evapotranspiration. So you expect evapotranspiration increases due to the irrigation if it's an arid region. So you get the Indus River, the only area that you have irrigation during December, January, February is mostly in India, Indus River Basin in the early 20th century. June, July, August, you can see the increases in evapotranspiration, Indus River Basin, parts of northeastern China. But as we get to end of 20th century, these increases are much more profound. So we see, again, the same regions popping up, more irrigation in Eurasia, that region. Ogallala aquifer pops up, and California pops up. Now you see increases in evapotranspiration in the Sahel. Now that's not due to irrigation, that's due to shifts in rainfall. So when we add in irrigation, we have non-local impacts of irrigation, meaning some dynamical impacts within the climate model that affects precipitation patterns. And so one of the things that the intercomparison project is trying to focus on is trying to understand when you have non-local impacts of land surface modification, whether or not those non-local impacts are robust. Are they consistent across models? Now some of these remote increases in precipitation, we're not going to have so much confidence in. But more local impacts we might be more confident in. So you see, as you move to the end of the 20th century, there's basically our tropical rain belts have been shifted, so we had increases in precipitation in the Sahel. So that's maybe not something that we'd be so confident in. But when you do have irrigation, you might expect downwind of your irrigated area that you might have increases in precipitation due to the increase in moisture into the atmosphere. So if you take a look closely, and I won't go through this in detail right now, but downwind of the Ogallala aquifer within the model, we do see increases in precipitation. So that increase in transport and precipitation. In India, interestingly, we have this drying out over India, and then that's related to monsoon dynamics. So if your land surface cools due to irrigation, then you're shifting or affecting your monsoon dynamics, and Sonali is going to be looking at this in more detail. But in our case, we can't really, this was with fixed sea surface temperatures, so we don't have that interactive ocean model to say anything conclusive about impacts on the monsoon dynamics. But we do see that drying out in peninsular India. So that's another aspect of this land change that's important, or land use modification that's important. If we begin to modify land surface temperatures, what are the other impacts on the climate system at a larger scale?
Did you compare those changes to observations at all?
Well,
I thought the Sahel was dry for a long time.
Right. So
Not yet.
these changes are non-local. I mean,
Yeah.
and precipitation itself is
Yeah, I get it.
it's difficult. So we didn't go in. I mean, it would be hard to. I mean, we wouldn't expect these such large scale changes associated with this
Well, you
with
would
the
have expected a
irrigation.
decline, just because,
Yeah, I mean, so this is a shift
Yeah.
in. I mean, we have to see what the control simulation, those precipitation values, whether or not we've improved things or not. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, it's not so reasonable to argue that adding
But I
in
mean, the
irrigation
observations
improves.
show, very dry conditions, and I'm not sure where they are, and there's not an awful lot of meteorological stations in the Sahel either, that's a problem, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And this is not, you know, again, it's a non-local impact that's maybe not, we you know, it's not necessarily robust across
Yeah.
models, so it's not something that, well, it has to be looked at in more detail. Other models that have included irrigation for the current climate, they did find these non-local impacts of irrigation. So that's a question, you know, to look at further. The temperature, you know, as we would expect, we have cooling in areas where you had increased evapotranspiration. That's early 20th century, again, late 20th century. You see some more cooling, you know, and then December, January, February, you have warming. No, this is something that we're, again, another non-local impact that you wouldn't have so much confidence in. But, you know, in this model, at the resolution we ran at, you know, this was found to be significant warming in December, January, February. But we see the cooling, it's co-located with the irrigation areas, Ogallala Aquifer out in California, and then the other areas. We have warming in India where you had that drying out, reduced precipitation, so there was warming in that region.
Why do you have changes in Greenland?
So why do we have changes in Greenland? Well, so I mean, we're shifting some of these larger pressure fields, or larger atmospheric circulation. So we do have these. Yeah. So the cooler temperatures then affect the other temperature or air patterns. So.
Michael, when you take water from aquifer, which temperature do you assign to it?
I think we assigned the temperature of the land surface, the first layer. So we.
Because essentially you add some energy or subtract some energy from the model, so some shifts in surface temperature may be due to this artificial effect that you actually.
Yeah, I mean, I believe.
I mean, these warmings anyway are due to just circulation changes. I mean, we get a amped up, for whatever reason, we get an amped up pollution low that brings in a lot of warm air convection during the winter time. And we also get a circulation response over Eurasia that also advects more southerly air into the, you know, sort of that part of the continent there. And, you know, as Michael said, that's the sort of stuff that we're less confident in as far as the model response goes.
These are still filtered for significance, though.
These were filtered for
Yeah.
significance, yeah. But yeah, when you take that mask away, then you see these, you know, these larger patterns emerge. So, and actually, I'll show some of that for the urban stuff, urban results. Just to zoom in on some of the regions. So if we look at Western North America over the 20th century, we have irrigation simulation is temperature, precipitation, and so the blue is irrigation, red is control. So we see, you know, cooler temperatures due to irrigation, especially after, you know, 1970 or so. So we see a pretty significant cooling within the model. Precipitation, we also see somewhat of an increase if we average over this box. And this is China. Again, we have, you know, this is the irrigation in China, and again, that is one of the largest rates globally. And so we see, you know, pretty substantial cooling, and for most years it was wetter for this region if we average over this region. Then India, we again have the cooling, but we have less precipitation if we're averaging over all of India, and that was because of this impacts on the monsoon system. So that's why it's a bit drier in the irrigation case. So those are the regional effects. Just to get a sense of, why different temperature responses, why does it depend on region? And this really relates back to evapotranspiration. So if you're familiar with the term evaporative fraction, it's very similar to the Bowen ratio. So basically that's our latent heat flux divided by the sum of the latent heat flux plus the sensible heat flux. So you would expect if you're in a wet region, your evaporative fraction will be close to 1. If you're a dry region, evaporative fraction will be small, closer to 0. This is a plot of basically evaporative fraction versus soil moisture. And so if you have a lot of water in your soil, on average, then evapotranspiration is going to be a process that's limited by energy, meaning the solar energy to your land surface. So it's a energy limited regime. If your soil moisture becomes somewhat dry, then evapotranspiration becomes soil moisture limited. And that's simply due to the fact that plants, when they're taking water out of the soil, if the soil is too dry, the plants have to pull too hard to pump up that water, and that damages the plant tissue. So to deal with those periods of very dry conditions, your plants have stomata on the leaves, and they can control the transpiration rate. So essentially, when you have very dry soils, your plants begin to reduce transpiration, and so your evaporative fraction begins to be reduced because you're reducing your latent heat flux. So we can think about this, in 3 regions. When you're very dry, you're in a soil moisture controlled regime, meaning your evapotranspiration is controlled by soil moisture. So if you add irrigation water to that soil, in that dry regime, you expect your latent heat flux to increase. And if your latent heat flux increases, your sensible heat flux decreases, and you could potentially have cooling of your surface. If your soil moisture on average is in between those regions, then you might have some cooling, but your evaporative fraction will be less sensitive to the irrigation just because you're generally a bit wetter. And if you're in a wet region, you're in energy controlled. Evapotranspiration is energy controlled, so adding irrigation to the soil is not going to really impact the temperatures. So that's why, if we then take a look at the impacts on temperature, some regions, these portions of China are not very dry, so adding lots of irrigation water is not really going to increase your latent heat flux, or the ratio, or the relative amount of latent heat versus sensible heat. So then that's why we're not having cooling there. But in more arid regions, like in the Indus River Basin, it's a very arid region. The water for the Indus River comes from the Himalayas. So even though it's arid, you have water there, and that's then used and applied to the land. So in that regime, applying irrigation has a much greater impact on your energy partitioning at the surface. So that's why you would have cooling in those regions. Does that make sense?
Do you have a map of the fluxes?
No, I don't have that. Of the latent and sensible heat fluxes? No, well, just evapotranspiration would be our so when we looked at here's the evapotranspiration, or basically our latent heat flux, and so you see, they increase substantially over those arid regions, whereas you don't have those increases over most of China, except in the arid northeastern parts.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, so you can kind of use this to help guide your eye as to where your non-local is related to a circulation response.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking one of the difficulties of the non-local pieces, locally, you might actually have circulation changes working against your evapotranspiration, right?
That's right, yeah.
But if you line this up with your temperature change, it becomes very clean.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So, alright, so that was irrigation. paper, I'm gonna just go through this very quickly, where we looked at irrigation, so that cooling associated with irrigation, how that might change between the present and the future. And you could think about this impact of irrigation as a masking effect almost. So if we're observing temperature changes in a region, if irrigation's exerting a cooling impact on the surface air temperatures, then you might say that's masking the, any warming associated with greenhouse gas forcings in the atmosphere. So we took a look at some of these things, just in the interest of time, because I did want to get to some of the urban stuff. I'll skip this, but we can talk about this later. But these are just, again, the same type of experiments. We did modern control runs with and without irrigation. We did future control runs with and without irrigation. And we looked at whether or not the cooling will change into the future. So, at the end of the day, we came down looking at regions where red indicates the cooling effect of irrigation has diminished in the future, and blue areas indicate where you might have some increases in cooling in the future.
What order global mean temperature changes are we talking about? Is this a few hundredths of a degree? Or?
For the
irrigation-induced temperature changes,
Yeah, so I mean it's
because it can't be a few tenths of a degree, right? It seems too.
so these are the future cooling anyway. So it's between 1 and 3 degrees
Local
cooling.
In some places.
In some places, yeah. I mean, globally average it's much smaller. But those areas that are arid and you added irrigation water, those are where you would have the most impact. Otherwise, I would say it's 1 degree or less.
So do you see it in those stations at the end of this? I mean, are those places, and I can't imagine anthropogenic is 3 degrees warming in that short period. So are you seeing this kind of cooling? Because my impression there is that the maximum temperatures are going up and the minimum temperatures are going down because of that's just local stability and winds that they blame for it, right? But I mean, that's a big signal. I don't know if you can see that.
I mean, as sort of Michael pointed out earlier, part of the problem is that we're at 2 by 2.5 degrees.
Yeah.
A lot of these grid cells are completely vegetated, and we're distributing this irrigation water over that entire grid cell. And so actually, we've rerun with the cube sphere some irrigation experiments, and we still see a significant impact, but it's definitely much diminished compared to.
So in the end, you see this as contributing, but not overwhelming the anthropogenic climate change signal. Or
yeah,
not
I mean, it
contributing
depends.
significantly.
I think there's evidence in like the Central Valley of California.
Yeah.
Laura Keppers and a few others have done work there that I think have shown that it's masking some of the anthropogenic signal.
I think masking influences have also been seen in India as well, especially over sort of the Indo-Gangetic Plain and that sort of region. If you compare it to other latitude belts around the globe, it's not that it's not warming, it's just not displaying the degree of warming.
It's muted, right?
Yeah.
I mean, part of that is conflated too with the brown cloud.
Yes,
which is-
that's all
Yeah.
And did you say that the irrigation water was spread over the whole cell, even though there may be,
over the whole vegetated fraction of the cell. And that's
so not the cultivated or whatever it's called?
Well,
Or
it's not
whatever you-
separate. I mean, within a grid cell, we only have a bare soil column and a vegetated soil column. And so all the vegetation, whether it's natural or crop, is all sharing that single soil column.
It's sharing the column, but don't you have, the surfaces are different, right? So is there a way?
But I think it's just a weighted sum, right? Based on the vegetation types and the vegetation parameters.
Yeah, I mean the fluxes of the
Surface is pretty much the same. I mean, once you add water to the surface model, it basically spreads it over vegetated fraction. So the amount of water which was added was correct, but then you immediately assume that
You didn't
spreading
say
goes into the
combined.
forests
Yeah.
and.
So as we move to the higher resolution model, that those impacts of that assumption become less. You go to a 1 by 1 degree grid cell, then the heavily irrigated areas, most of that grid cell is actually agriculture. So as we move, the model moves to that higher resolution, that impact becomes less.
So just curious, Michael, before we move on from irrigation. So India and China, they had their irrigation sources were of the order of the total amount of mass that's being shed from the great ice sheets, you know, hundreds of cubic kilometers a year. I know the source for India, a lot of it is fossil groundwater, right? But what about China? Is that the same deal?
Well, it's a mixture of surface water and groundwater. I mean, there's tremendous amounts of irrigation from, you know, the Yellow River and Yangtze River. So those, I mean, actually those rates of irrigation are pretty, I mean, so the amounts of water they're taking from those rivers is pretty substantial. So.
But there's also a lot from rainfall. As I said, this, you know, this terracing and stuff, it's straight rainfall too.
Right.
So it's a lot less. That's the key, yeah.
Yeah. So, I'll just briefly go through.
You have to talk for 2 more weeks.
Well, this is just a study that Ben's led in looking at deforestation as an amplifier of drought in Mesoamerica. And basically, you know, you had your pre-Columbus vegetation, so lots of agriculture in the region. Post-Columbus, there was less agriculture, less people, less agriculture, and here's our modern land cover. And so, yeah, I won't talk about this in detail, but essentially there was, because of the land cover change, if you look at the deforested compared to natural vegetation, we see decreases in precipitation over the Yucatan Peninsula. So that's another type of work that we're currently doing. And what I wanted to get to is the recent work on urbanization. So basically, we want to put in a simple type model into the GISS climate model to look at impacts of urban regions on temperature, much as we had looked at the impacts of irrigation on temperature. Now, NCAR, they have gone ahead with some of this work. They put in somewhat complex model, what's called the urban canopy model. And they're keeping track of all the fluxes of energy and water, you know, on the roofs within a grid cell, on your what's referred to as the canyon floor. So they keep track of, you know, if you have pervious pavement, impervious pavement, and then they keep track of fluxes on these walls. So they're trying to put in somewhat of a complex model with the goal of getting the temperature in your urban region, and then comparing that with the rural temperature within a grid cell. So that's, they're trying to look at the differences in temperatures within a climate model grid cell between rural and urban areas. And this is their approach. For our purposes, we want to look at, you know, the climate impacts of urban changes. One other paper has done this, and we're looking to do this as well. Based on the structure of the model, we wanted to treat urban areas as bare soil, essentially. And so, just because we have these vegetated soil column and bare soil column, and then we want to modify our infiltration based upon the permeability of your land surface. So if you have urban areas, you know, less permeable soil. We also fix the albedo of your urban area. And then something that we're in the process of doing is fixing the roughness length, because your urban areas will have a different roughness length than vegetation. So first thought was to take the urban albedos from NCAR, because they did a very detailed study of roof materials and road types, and they came up with this global map of urban albedos. And it varied, you know, depending upon, you know, India has different, you know, roof materials and roads than we do in Western US. So we said, oh, okay, let's put that in. Well,
Stewart's white roofs on there?
Well, that was a problem, because when we went and looked at the albedo values for vegetation in the Model E, this is from the 1983 Jim Hansen paper. I know it's small, but the point, all of these albedos are somewhat biased small compared to observations. So we ended up, because if we put in these albedos, we ended up, our urban areas were brighter than the background vegetation. So we ended up setting the urban albedo to the lowest value in the GISS Model E. just because we wanted to reduce the albedo. So that's what we did. The other thing, they had estimates of impervious fraction. So if you have road cover, that water should run off eventually into the streams, not infiltrate into the soil. So they had these maps to estimate impervious cover, depending upon the area of roof within your urban area and things like that. So I said, well, let's use their impervious fractions.
Why is it so large, such large areas, or
Well, so
covered with
that's
those
just
numbers? Since is it?
This is just
Is it towns and everything?
Well, no, this is just any grid cell that had an urban area. So
Just got
this
the
is not the fractions. So the fractions are here. You can see this is again, most grid cells have between 1% and 5% urban, and you can see that Chicago, New York's, our regions of high urbanization, India, China again. So those are our urban areas. We ran this with the 1x1 model. In the interest of time, I'll just quickly go through this. So when we treated urban areas with that impervious map, estimates of impervious fraction, we got a tremendous response of the model. So it really impacted our precipitation. Even though we were changing those, so we compared with natural, so the base vegetation, and then we removed that vegetation for the urban areas. When we used the impervious land cover data from NCAR, we had this, ridiculous response of precipitation. If I allowed the water on these urban areas to infiltrate into the soil, just as it does with the bare soil, that response to urbanization was much more muted. This is without any masking, no significance masking, just to show, we had, in areas with lots of urbanization, we have this decrease in precipitation. You can see, the major urban areas popping up, or the most intense land cover change. So we have that impact on precipitation, and then that drives our temperature changes, which are here. So we have increases in temperature, partly due to changes in precipitation and partly due to the albedo effect. When you have those really large changes in precipitation, then we have unrealistically large changes in temperature. So I guess I'll just wrap up there. This is the histogram comparing control and urban. You see this shift, and this is due. This is a grid cell average temperature, so it's not. We don't have that separate urban temperature within a grid cell, but we do see this warming effect. So we're doing other experiments, again with the roughness length, and to try and hone in or zero in on the best simple type model to include. All right, so anyways, I'll just end with this. This is our land model. We have these different land cover types. We're adding in this urban fraction. Other things we like to do is add in reservoirs to keep track of water within the climate model. We have deep soil water or groundwater already in the model. We're working on that. Various other improvements. And then just lastly, it would be nice to then include some of these human uses of water within the climate model framework. So, all right, thanks a lot. Thanks for
We've tormented you with enough questions, probably. Or I haven't. Yes.
Just joined it.
All right, well, thanks a lot. If you have any questions, just stop by my office.